All right, so we are going to continue evaluating scientific claims. We had just talked about bias, and now we want to talk about the funding source. So it's important to kind of look at where did the money come from to support that research. So a lot of times we have private sources of money and government sources of money. And typically if it's funded by the federal government, it's deemed to be not as biased as something that was funded by private funds. So the federal government is basically backed by the taxpayers. So this is money that's coming from a broad group of individuals. And so therefore this money might be fed into the Center for Disease Control, the National Institute of Health, and other agencies that can use that funding to conduct research. If you look at businesses and industries that provide money, usually they're providing that money for a certain reason, right? They want to look at a certain issue or a certain application. So there could be much more bias associated with that. Doesn't mean that there is. It's just you want to evaluate it. So this is just one more tool in evaluating a scientific claim, is to look at the funding source. So we also want to look at the source of the scientific claim. All right, so where does this information come from? So we can look at what we call primary literature and secondary literature. So primary literature is basically where that information was first published. So if it's scientific research, it's going to be typically published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. And we know that scientific journals or peer-reviewed ones, right, that they have evaluated this experiment, and they have kind of looked over it to make sure that the conclusions that were drawn are based on the data, that the experiment was conducted appropriately according to the scientific method, and that everything is as it should be. So you've got several different pairs of eyes. So these reviewers are going through that research with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that it is valid research. And then it will be published in one of these journals. So you can see the Journal of the American Medical Association, the Ecological Society of America, we have Science, we have Nature. These are all peer-reviewed journals. And so this is the area where research is first reported, so it's called primary literature. Secondary literature, on the other hand, is typically a summary of the primary literature. So we find this more in textbooks, or sometimes some of these magazines will publish review articles about the research. And so it's much more easier to understand than the primary source, right? Because the primary literature is going to have it in a certain format. You're going to have an abstract, you're going to have an introduction, a materials and methods, and then your results section and a discussion section. And an article that appears in one of these science magazines is going to be a lot shorter. It's going to put it in words that are easier to understand, and make it a lot easier for somebody who is not in the scientific field to understand this information. So it doesn't mean it's less reliable, right? It's just a different way of reading the information. So one way to tell that it's trustworthy is if they have actually referenced the primary literature, the original source of the scientific study. And that's what you want to look for. Are they just kind of reporting it? Where did they get their information from, right? You want to make sure that they are going back to the primary literature. So secondary literature would be newspapers like the New York Times, Popular Science, Discover, even National Geographic. These are all secondary literature, right? So they're still respected institutions. It's just another way of presenting the information. So social media, is that a reputable source? Not usually. It can be a source of information, and it may cause you, therefore, to go looking into something and dig deeper. Um, but it's not something that you would typically want to use as your only source of information, right? So most social media is not going to go back to your primary literature source and reference it. So it just depends. You might have a blog by a scientist, and I've seen some very well-written blogs on different topics. So it could be pretty good. It just depends on how in-depth of material you're looking for. Okay, so it depends on the credentials of the individual. Are they referencing any other sources of literature to back up whatever they are talking about? That's what you want to look for. So, scientific claims in media. So we have a question here. It says, where would you place a blog in this figure? Right? So we've got social media on the left, secondary literature in the middle, and primary literature all the way to the right. So is a blog considered primary literature? No. Is it considered secondary literature? Not even there, but usually somewhere around this social media is what we're looking for. And once again, kind of depends on who it's written by and if they've made any references to other literature sources as to whether you might elevate it a little higher up, especially compared to all these little kind of Twitter links and things like that. It might be a little bit closer to the secondary literature if it's got a lot more references and it's written by a reputable individual. So we've been talking about pseudoscience, right? Kind of alluding to that. So pseudoscience basically kind of refers to beliefs or practices or scientific claims, as we've been talking about, that are presented as if they are science or they're scientific in nature, but they lack the evidence or they lack the rigor that really characterizes genuine science. So unlike science, which relies on evidence, where we've got a hypothesis that can be tested, where it's being subjected to peer review, pseudoscience a lot of times just depends on anecdotal evidence, or it's some appeal that's being made. It's usually untested assertions a lot of times. So as it says here, they tend to be untested, right? So there's no experimentation behind there. Because there's no experimentation, there's no evidence. A lot of times they will attack critics. So by doing this, it kind of shifts the attention away from them, right? So you're not really paying attention to what their claim is. You're paying attention to what the attack is and why the other side is wrong. So you're not looking in depth into what they are doing. You're focused on the other side. A lot of times they'll use buzzwords, things that are going to kind of lure you in, or terms that you like to hear. So detox diet is kind of these fad terms, or serum infused, right? So we're using kind of this scientific jargon to attract people and make it sound like it's pretty, very scientific, right? This has got to be good stuff. Or it could appeal to your emotion, all right, and make you feel like you should be feeling this way, or you should accept this information for whatever reasons, okay? And the issue becomes, that pseudoscience can be kind of dangerous because it does mislead people, and it can waste resources, and it can pose a risk to health and safety, especially when it comes down to making personal medical decisions, if you're making medical decisions based on this type of information. All right, and you're being lured in by this. All right, one other thing that I want to talk about is what's called correlation and causation. And this is really important. So understanding the difference between correlation and causation is essential in interpreting data accurately. Correlation refers basically to a statistical relationship. It's saying that there's an association between two variables so that when one variable changes, the other tends to change as well. But this does not mean that the one variable causes the change in the other one. All right, so they're just simply correlated. All right, so if you can look at one point on a graph for one variable, you should be able to predict where the other variable will be on that graph as well. But it doesn't mean one causes the other one. So causation, on the other hand, implies a direct cause and effect relationship, where one variable directly influences the other one. All right. So there's a classic example of an observed correlation between ice cream sales and drowning incidents, or I've heard ice cream sales and shark attacks, that there's a correlation between these, right? But one does not cause the other. So increased ice cream sales do not cause more people to drown. So just because you've had an ice cream cone or a big bowl of ice cream and then you go out swimming doesn't mean that you're more likely to drown. There's another factor, another variable at play here, and that's temperature. So the idea is that more people are eating ice cream because it's hot out, and because it's hot out, more people go swimming. So one does not cause the other. They can be correlated because it's hot outside. So there's a relationship between them, but one does not cause the other. And so you've got to be careful about that when you're looking at data. So here we have an example. Some Reddit user posted this graph that shows over the years, in purple, autism rates have been increasing. And on the left-hand side, it shows organic food sales with the red line on the graph. And it shows that organic food sales have also increased during the same time frame, and that the two lines look very closely aligned. So there's a correlation, but it doesn't mean that because more people are eating organic food, that organic foods are causing autism. All right, so correlation is not causation. You need to be careful about it. Two things can show the same trends, but it doesn't mean that one causes the other. All right, so with evaluating scientific claims, we said you want to look at the credentials of the individual. All right, check that out. Do they have the right credentials? Has the claim been reviewed by other scientists? Has it been published in a primary journal? Is there any bias by the individuals that are involved? What is their funding source? And has it met the scientific standard? All right, has there been scientific studies to back up these claims? Okay.